Today we're starting a 3-week series called Parenting Children in a Sexualized Culture, and I'm joined by Pastor Dan Martin. Dan, before we even get into your points for today, what do you mean by sexualized culture? Because this has a lot to do with how parenting has changed so much, right?
Yeah, well, parenting has changed tremendously, and primarily in the digital age, now with all the technology that we have, our kids are just inundated with sexualized messages. You know, I saw a study not too long ago that our kids are exposed to over 14,000 sexualized messages every year. And for a lot of parents, you know, we think a one-time sex talk is going to take care of that.
Which is hard enough, and most parents don't even get to that, right?
Yeah, but the fact that the culture is just constantly speaking to them and has something to say about this topic. When I think about a sexualized culture, I just think about that.
Yeah. So let's start with the definition. How would you define purity? Because that's what we're talking about. We're talking about purity. We want to raise kids who are pure, right? In terms of their sexual experiences and the way they look at things.
Right. You know, I have a term that I use with my kids and as I talk to parents, and it's not so much about talking about purity as it is talking about the pursuit of purity. I grew up in a culture and in an environment where it seemed as if purity was something I could attain or something I could do to accomplish it. And what I've discovered and what the Bible tells us is that purity is a relationship. It's not an accomplishment. 1 John 3:3 tells us everyone who has this hope in him, Jesus, everyone who has this hope in him purifies himself just as he is pure. It is his work in me that is purifying me. And I think it's important to start there because I think so often we think, you know, purity is abstinence or purity is not doing, you know, this list of thou shalt nots. And really what it is, it's about a daily decision to say, hey, I'm going to pursue purity. I'm going to pursue, which ultimately is the pursuit of Jesus Christ. It's his work in us that purifies us. And so I think it's important to not talk about staying pure. You know, the Bible tells us that none of us are pure. None of us, all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. And so this idea of staying pure is even a misnomer because it's not about staying pure, it's about Christ purifying me. And so when we think of it that way, when we think of purity as an accomplishment, what happens is, well, what happens when we mess up? You know, or what happens when I'm no longer on the purity train?
Right.
I made a bad decision,
or someone else made a bad decision,
or someone made a bad decision, and something happened to me. And so the hope in that pursuing purity is that I'm not out of the purity club because I messed up. Because I mean, think about where Jesus set the bar on purity. In Matthew 5, he talks about, you know, you've heard it said, don't commit adultery. And I say, if you even think about a woman lustfully, like you've committed adultery, who isn't guilty of that?
Right.
And so this idea of staying pure versus talking to our kids about pursuing purity. And the other thing I really like about that definition is it allows me to invite my kids into that journey with me. Hey, you and I, as I'm talking to my kids, we're on this journey together. We're both pursuing purity. Because as a man who's been married for 28 years, I figured out purity did not end on the wedding night. And I have 2 married kids now, one that's not married, and my message to them, hey, your pursuit of purity doesn't end on the wedding night. It goes on.
Yeah, and what I like about that is then it's not, you know, for my 16-year-old son, I'm not thinking, well, you're in this journey on your own. I've already I've made it because I'm married now, right? As if I don't have any temptation anymore or anything like that. Yeah,
and you know, I can't tell you how many people I've talked to, a lot of men that I've talked to, where really this journey for them didn't become a struggle until after marriage, where they were kind of set up to think, man, if I can just make it to my wedding night, you know, if I can just make it there, to cross the finish line, you know, like everything will be good and everything will be great. And that's just not the case. You know, the enemy finds all kinds of ways to weave his way in, whether that's pornography, whether that's lust, whether that's an affair, whatever that might be. That's an ongoing struggle. The other interesting thing about that, when you talk about the purity not ending on the wedding night, I saw a statistic the other day that the largest group of people right now cohabitating are adults over the age of 60. And so when you think about that, when you think about the fact that people in their 60s are living together, and the pursuit of purity and Jesus' call on our lives to remain sexually pure, that doesn't end when we get married. That goes on. It keeps going on.
So what would you say to parents who have kids that are already married off? Is their job done?
That's funny. I have 2 kids who are married, and I've told them the same thing. Hey, your pursuit of purity, it's not like the wedding night was it. It's like my job as a parent, and my hope and prayer for you is that you'll pursue purity the rest of your lives. And that when you one day have kids, you will invite your kids into that journey, because it doesn't ever end.
Yeah. Dan, one last thing before, and we'll cover more topics in the next video, but you talk about whose job purity is at the end of the day, right? Is it all up to me and my willpower or my son's willpower?
By the grace of God, it's not.
Yeah.
And that's, for all of us, that's good news, because ultimately the work of purity is the work of Christ in me. And just that he is purifying me. I mean, the Bible talks about this in a number of different ways. It always uses the analogy of the wedding feast, that Christ is purifying his bride. The good news in that is that I'm not yet there, and so I'm going to mess up. And so there's grace for me in that. The other good news is that Christ in me is not leaving me on my own. It's not up to me. It's his work in me that's ultimately purifying us.